Have you ever wondered why life seems to be filled with so much suffering? Why pain, loss, and hardship seem to shadow every bright moment we experience? Why, no matter how carefully we plan, how much we protect ourselves, or how desperately we chase happiness, suffering eventually finds its way to us? What if I told you that suffering isn't a flaw in the design of life, but a fundamental part of it? What if pain has meaning, a hidden purpose that philosophers have been trying to unravel for thousands of years? Stay with me, because today we're going to explore the philosophy of suffering, and by the end of this journey, you might never see your pain the same way again. Since the dawn of human consciousness, suffering has occupied a central place in every culture's stories, religions, and philosophies. Ancient myths spoke of gods who suffered, heroes who endured unimaginable trials, and ordinary people who faced the cruelty of fate. Suffering wasn't just acknowledged, it was honored, explored, and sometimes even embraced. Why? Because human beings instinctively knew that suffering reveals something profound about the nature of existence. The ancient Greeks saw suffering as the natural consequence of human flaws and the unpredictability of the cosmos. Tragic plays like those of Sophocles and Aeschylus didn't shy away from pain. They placed it center stage. Characters like Oedipus and Antigone faced horrors not as punishments, but as inevitable encounters with destiny. The Greeks believed suffering could teach wisdom. It strips away illusion, confronts us with our mortality, and forces us to see what really matters. The Stoic philosophers took this understanding a step further. For them, suffering was not something to be avoided, but something to be transformed. Marcus Aurelius, a Roman emperor burdened with personal loss and the horrors of war, wrote in his meditations that pain is merely perception, and perception is within our control. If you are distressed by anything external, he wrote, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. Suffering becomes unbearable only when we resist it. Epictetus, born a slave and later one of the greatest Stoic teachers, believed suffering was the forge in which character is made. He taught that while we cannot control external events, we can control our responses. To the Stoics, adversity was a training ground for the soul. Pain is not an enemy, but a tutor. Each hardship invites us to practice patience, resilience, courage, and wisdom. To suffer well, they argued, is to live well. In the East, philosophies like Buddhism viewed suffering through yet another lens. The Buddha identified suffering, or dukkha, as one of the fundamental truths of existence. Birth, aging, sickness, and death are inevitable, and attachment to transient things breeds inevitable pain. But unlike philosophies that see suffering as merely tragic, Buddhism frames it as the starting point for liberation. By understanding the nature of suffering, its causes, and how it operates, one can learn to transcend it. The Four Noble Truths teach that life is suffering, that suffering is caused by desire and attachment, that it can be overcome, and that the way to overcome it is through the Eightfold Path. A disciplined approach to living ethically, thinking clearly, and developing deep awareness. Suffering, in this view, is not an accidental misfortune, but the very context in which we can awaken to a deeper, unshakable peace. Across cultures, philosophers and mystics recognized suffering as both a danger and a doorway. Friedrich Nietzsche famously wrote, "To live is to suffer, to survive is to find some meaning in the suffering." Nietzsche believed that suffering was not inherently valuable, but that it becomes meaningful when it drives us to create, to overcome, and to transform ourselves. He coined the phrase Amor Fati, love of fate, as a radical acceptance of life in all its pain and beauty. For Nietzsche, those who can say yes to suffering, who can integrate it rather than run from it, become stronger, deeper, more creative. Modern psychology has also picked up this thread. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, built his philosophy of logotherapy around the idea that human beings can endure almost any suffering if they find meaning in it. In his book Man's Search for Meaning, Frankl observed that those who survived the concentration camps were not the physically strongest, but those who held on to a purpose, whether it was love, faith, or a future task yet to be fulfilled. He wrote, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." The idea that suffering can be a crucible for transformation isn't just abstract theory. It plays out in everyday life. Think about the most difficult moments you've endured: heartbreak, betrayal, loss, illness, failure. As painful as those experiences were, didn't they also strip away the superficial? Didn't they reveal what you truly value, what you're capable of, and what matters most? There's a reason the phrase, "what doesn't kill you makes you stronger," persists. Not because suffering is good in itself, but because within it lies the potential for strength. But let's be honest, not all suffering feels noble or transformative. Some of it feels senseless, random, cruel. The sudden death of a child, a devastating accident, a war that claims innocent lives. Philosophers have long wrestled with this darker face of suffering. If life is governed by any kind of order or justice, why do the innocent suffer? This question lies at the heart of the problem of evil in philosophy and theology. In religious traditions, this dilemma has different answers. In Christianity, suffering is sometimes framed as a test, a consequence of free will, or a mystery known only to God. The story of Job in the Hebrew Bible, a man who suffers unspeakable losses without cause, confronts this head-on. Job's ultimate lesson is not why he suffers, but how he responds with honesty, grief, and ultimately, humility before the unknown. In Hindu philosophy, the doctrine of karma proposes that suffering results from actions in past lives, part of a cosmic moral order. Yet even here, the emphasis is on how one responds. Acceptance, detachment, and righteous action are seen as the appropriate paths through suffering. The existential philosophers of the 20th century, like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, faced suffering without recourse to divine explanations. In a universe without inherent meaning, suffering is absurd. And yet, it is precisely in the face of absurdity that we must create our own meaning. Camus famously wrote that we must imagine Sisyphus, condemned to roll a boulder up a hill forever, as happy. Not because his suffering disappears, but because he claims ownership of his fate. This confrontation with suffering without illusions is both terrifying and liberating. It means we cannot escape pain, nor necessarily explain it, but we can choose how we bear it. In this freedom, we find a kind of dignity, a space to assert our humanity against the indifference of the universe. Suffering, then, may be the most reliable teacher we have. It strips away comforts, challenges assumptions, humbles egos, and forces us to confront our limitations. It teaches us empathy by revealing our shared fragility. It deepens our character by testing our values. It compels us to ask the deepest questions. Who am I without my comforts? What truly matters? What is worth enduring for? And perhaps most importantly, how can I transform my pain into wisdom, compassion, and strength? The history of philosophy suggests that suffering is inseparable from the human condition. Whether as punishment, test, accident, or mystery, it touches every life. The crucial difference lies in how we meet it. Do we curse it, deny it, run from it? Or do we face it squarely, seeking to wrest meaning from its grip? In doing so, we join a lineage of thinkers, mystics, and survivors who, across centuries and cultures, have looked into the darkness and chosen not to turn away. They understood what modern society so often forgets, that a life spent avoiding suffering is a shallow life. That real wisdom, depth, and resilience are born not in perpetual comfort, but in the fires of adversity. If suffering is so universal, so deeply interwoven into the fabric of existence, why does it continue to surprise us? Why, after thousands of years of wisdom traditions and countless personal experiences, do we still recoil from pain as if it were an alien force rather than a fundamental aspect of being alive? Perhaps it's because modern culture, more than any civilization before, has built its identity around the avoidance of discomfort. We anesthetize, distract, entertain, and numb ourselves in 1,000 ways, always seeking the next dopamine hit, always running from the shadows. This desperate attempt to eliminate suffering has, paradoxically, made it harder to bear. The Stoics warned of this. Seneca wrote that while we fear death and pain, it is not these things themselves, but our fear of them, that enslaves us. A society that refuses to acknowledge the necessity of suffering breeds fragility. It raises individuals unprepared for loss, disappointment, or failure. When suffering inevitably arrives, as it always does, many are left disoriented, hollow, and afraid. But what if, instead of denying suffering, we learn to expect it, even prepare for it? Not in a morbid or pessimistic sense, but as a sober acceptance of life's reality. The Stoics practiced negative visualization, imagining the loss of what they cherished most, not to become numb, but to appreciate their blessings and steel themselves for inevitable hardships. By facing hypothetical suffering in the mind, one builds resilience for when it comes in the flesh. Modern psychology echoes this wisdom. Studies in resilience psychology show that individuals who confront difficult emotions and situations head-on, rather than avoiding them, develop greater emotional strength. Post-traumatic growth, a phenomenon where people emerge stronger after enduring crises, reveals that suffering can deepen relationships, clarify values, and increase life satisfaction when processed constructively. The Buddhist concept of impermanence also teaches us to see suffering not as a glitch in the system, but as a constant companion in a world where everything changes. Joy, love, security, all are fleeting. Clinging to them leads to inevitable pain. Recognizing impermanence doesn't require detachment from life's pleasures, but it does invite a more balanced relationship with them. It reminds us that both joy and sorrow pass, and both are part of the same fabric. Consider also the concept of kintsugi in Japanese philosophy, the art of repairing broken pottery with gold. Rather than hiding the cracks, kintsugi highlights them, transforming what was once broken into something beautiful and unique. The metaphor is clear. Our suffering, our wounds, are not to be concealed, but to be embraced as part of our story. They are evidence of having lived. Philosophy, at its best, does not promise to remove suffering, but to illuminate its nature and purpose. It teaches us to shift our perspective, to reframe suffering not as a purely negative experience, but as a neutral fact, one that can be transformed by how we relate to it. Pain can be a signal, a lesson, a test, a passage, or a mirror reflecting who we are beneath our roles and titles. Existentialists argued that suffering strips life of illusion. When confronted with the rawness of pain, we see the world not as we wish it to be, but as it is. This encounter can be devastating, yet it also offers a unique form of freedom. Without illusions, one is free to choose values consciously, to live not by inherited scripts, but by personal conviction. Camus called this defiance in the face of absurdity revolt, not a rebellion against suffering itself, which is futile, but a rebellion against despair. In this way, suffering can become a catalyst for authenticity. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What do I truly believe? What am I willing to endure for? What illusions am I ready to relinquish? Pain clarifies. It peels away the trivial and reveals what is essential. This is perhaps why so many profound spiritual transformations are preceded by a period of intense suffering. Mystics from all traditions, Christian, Sufi, Zen, Hindu, describe a dark night of the soul, a passage through inner desolation where old identities collapse and deeper truths emerge. It is in these moments, when familiar comforts are stripped away, that one can glimpse the eternal, the unchanging, the ground of being beneath the surface turbulence. Modern culture often pathologizes this process, labeling it depression, crisis, or breakdown. And while suffering should never be romanticized or trivialized, it's important to recognize that existential pain has always been part of the human journey toward wisdom. To suffer is not necessarily to be broken. It can also be to be initiated. This initiatory aspect of suffering was understood by ancient mystery schools, where initiates underwent symbolic deaths and rebirths through ritual ordeal. They were taught to die to their old selves, to descend into darkness, and to emerge transformed. The symbolism is striking, because it echoes what we experience emotionally and psychologically during life's hardest seasons. The death of a relationship, the collapse of a dream, the loss of status. These events kill a version of us, force us into liminal spaces where we are neither who we were nor yet who we will become. In these spaces, suffering is not a meaningless torment, but a rite of passage, a dissolving of false certainties that prepares us for deeper truths. How we respond to these moments matters profoundly. Some people resist, numb, deny, or escape into distractions. Others endure with bitterness, clinging to grievances. But those who engage with their suffering consciously, who ask what it has to teach them, often emerge with a new sense of clarity and purpose. The metaphor of the phoenix, a mythical bird reborn from its ashes, speaks to this. True transformation often requires a kind of death, not a literal end, but the burning away of outdated identities, illusions, and attachments. It is suffering that fuels this fire, that breaks the chains of complacency and pushes us into new forms of being. This is not to suggest that one should seek suffering for its own sake. Rather, when it comes, as it inevitably will, one should face it with courage and curiosity. What is this pain showing me? What illusions is it exposing? What values is it testing? How might it be preparing me for a deeper encounter with myself and the world? Even in the darkest moments, there is an opportunity for meaning. This is not a denial of pain's harshness, but a refusal to let it be pointless. Viktor Frankl argued that meaning can be found in every form of suffering, even when it cannot be removed. The question is not whether life will hurt, but whether we will let that hurt shape us or destroy us. It is a difficult, personal, and often lonely journey. No philosophy can fully prepare a person for their private grief, nor should it attempt to explain away every form of suffering. Some pains must be borne without answers. Yet, knowing that we walk a path well trodden by philosophers, poets, mystics, and survivors offers a form of quiet solidarity. The knowledge that others have endured and even grown through their suffering can be a small but steadying light in the darkness. And so we arrive at one of the most difficult but essential truths. Suffering will never leave us. No philosophy, no religion, no achievement, no amount of wealth, love, or power will ever insulate a person entirely from pain. It arrives in different forms at different times, sometimes expected, often not. And in its presence, all illusions fall away. What remains is the raw, undeniable reality of being alive in a world that offers no immunity from loss. But within this stark truth lies a paradoxical gift. Because when we accept suffering as an inevitable part of life, we stop wasting energy resisting it. Instead, we learn to live alongside it, to let it shape us rather than break us. In doing so, we gain a resilience that is not mere stoicism, not numb indifference, but a fierce, conscious courage. The courage to love despite knowing loss will come. The courage to try despite knowing failure is possible. The courage to live fully, knowing that every moment is fragile. One of the most profound lessons suffering offers is the understanding of impermanence. Everything changes. Every joy, every sorrow, every relationship, every possession, all will one day be gone. Suffering forces us to face this, not intellectually, but viscerally. And in that confrontation, we are invited to treasure what we have while we have it, to release what we cannot keep, and to live not in denial of loss, but in gratitude for presence. The ancients believed that those who understand suffering are those who live most deeply. Because once you see that every moment is temporary, every comfort uncertain, you begin to pay closer attention. You savor conversations. You notice small beauties. You speak truths you might have left unsaid. You forgive. You let go. You stop postponing what matters because you realize that postponement is the illusion of immortality, and immortality is not ours to claim. There's also a communal aspect to suffering. While pain isolates, it also connects. When you suffer, you join the vast human story. Across time, across cultures, every person who has ever lived has known some form of grief, fear, or despair. To recognize your pain as part of this lineage is to feel less alone. It's to understand that while your suffering is unique in its details, it is universal in its nature. And this recognition can foster empathy. It reminds us that behind every face we meet is a story, a struggle, a wound. This is why the greatest wisdom traditions urge compassion, not out of obligation, but out of solidarity. When we see the suffering in ourselves, we begin to see it in others. We soften. We grow patient. We extend kindness, not because life demands it, but because we know what it feels like to hurt. In this way, suffering, though unwanted, becomes a teacher of tenderness. There's a kind of dignity in suffering well, not in pretending to be unaffected or in romanticizing pain, but in facing it honestly, enduring it consciously, and allowing it to expand our capacity for understanding. The person who has suffered and reflected becomes a person who can hold space for others, who can listen without needing to fix, who can be present without turning away. Ultimately, the philosophy of suffering asks us not to avoid pain, but to work with it, to learn from it, to allow it to shape us into wiser, kinder, and more grounded human beings. It invites us to see suffering not as punishment, not as proof of life's cruelty, but as a fundamental texture of existence, no more avoidable than breath itself. Some of the most enduring art, literature, and wisdom have emerged from moments of profound suffering. The tragedies of Shakespeare, the poetry of Rumi, the meditations of Marcus Aurelius, the diaries of Holocaust survivors, the spiritual writings of mystics in exile. All these voices carry a resonance born of pain transformed into insight. And this is our task, too. Not merely to endure, but to transform. When we stop viewing suffering as a senseless interruption and start seeing it as part of the human curriculum, we step into our full humanity. We become more whole. Because to be human is to carry both joy and sorrow, to celebrate and to mourn, to hope and to despair, sometimes in the same day, sometimes in the same breath. There is no life untouched by suffering, but there can be a life unbroken by it. A life where pain is acknowledged, its lessons absorbed, and its inevitability accepted. This is not a defeatist stance, but a courageous one. It's the position of one who refuses to be diminished by pain, who insists on finding meaning where others find only misery. And in those moments, when we feel most stripped bare, most exposed, we often find our truest selves. Not the roles we play, not the masks we wear, but the raw, essential being that exists beneath it all. Suffering, for all its cruelty, often removes what is false, leaving behind what is real. This is why so many who have suffered deeply speak of a strange gratitude, not for the pain itself, but for what it revealed. The friendships that proved genuine, the inner strength they didn't know they had, the wisdom born from witnessing the transience of everything they once thought permanent. And so perhaps the final, paradoxical wisdom of suffering is this: it strips away the unnecessary, it tests our values, and it reveals what truly matters. It reminds us that though we cannot control the arrival of pain, we can choose our relationship to it. We can curse it, deny it, or we can meet it with a steady gaze, asking what it has come to teach us. What if, instead of asking why me, we asked what now? What can this moment of pain reveal? How might it make me gentler, stronger, wiser? What illusions might it shatter? What truths might it offer? Not because suffering is good, but because it is inevitable. And what is inevitable, we can either resist in vain or embrace as an unwilling companion on our path. As you finish this reflection, I invite you to think about the ways suffering has shaped your own life. What have your darkest moments revealed? What wisdom did they leave behind? Have there been pains that, though you would never have chosen them, gave you gifts you now quietly carry? I would love to hear your story. Share it in the comments below. Not because pain needs to be compared or measured, but because in telling our stories, we remind one another that we are not alone. That the path of suffering, though difficult, is also the path of wisdom, compassion, and the deepest kind of human connection.